As for myself, I'm Tina Walla, and I'm the Chief Partnerships Officer for U.S. Digital Response, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that provides pro bono technology support to governments. This series is a part of the Local Infrastructure Hub, which aims to help America's towns and cities take full advantage of federal infrastructure funding by helping to create competitive, winning bids that deliver real results for your residents. This session is brought to you by Cornell Tech and U.S. Digital Response and is supported by our funders Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ballmer Group, Emerson Collective, Ford Foundation, Kresge Foundation, and Waverly Street Foundation. Now, on the next slide, I want to give you a quick refresher on this series and what we're here to do. We aim to inspire local government leaders such as yourselves about the integration of technology that improves city infrastructure today and in the future. And y'all, we have a great session today for you that is it's so well aligned with these values. So excited to jump in. These 4 key values guide our series. First, we're driven by shared goals. We don't believe in technology for technology's sake. And again, if you saw the name of today's session, you might have thought, wait a minute, but hold off, wait for what we have to share today through our great speakers. Secondly, we want to design for people. Technology, processes, and products have to reflect the needs and desires of deeply diverse groups and individuals. We are not all the same. Third, we believe in approaching this work with a commitment to resourcing this work. And I want to name that today, on January 29th, there's a little bit up in flux as it relates to federal funds to support this work in communities like yours. But I want to name that in this series, we have been thinking about for the last 21 sessions, and including today, we think about long-term sustainability, and that includes planning for workforce, policies, and regulation. Last, but certainly not least, we want to build for trust. Tech and innovation should deliver solutions that are transparent, secure, available, reliable, durable, and mindful of privacy considerations. Now, on to today's session. Today, we're going to be focusing on how cities can explore how AI and augmented reality innovations can reshape infrastructure planning and management. I'm really excited about this discussion because we're taking something that feels complex and futuristic, and our speakers today are going to help make it accessible and help you understand what role these technologies can play in your communities. I'm really excited about our lineup today. But before we introduce our speakers, we want to take a quick moment to ask some poll questions to get a sense of where you and your communities are with respect to this issue. So as you see this poll window pop up, 3 questions for you. First, how familiar are you with augmented reality? Second question, what are your public engagement responsibilities around infrastructure projects? Just to give us a sense of who's in the Zoom room. And third, where do you need the most help from technology in your public engagement work? Thanks for taking a moment to answer those questions. And if we can go to the next slide, while folks are submitting their responses, I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speakers. Joining us to share their perspectives are Greg Lindsay, an urban tech fellow at Cornell Tech, Mindy Justice, a senior account manager with Murphy Epson, and Mark Wheeler, principal at Allogra. And Mark is the former CIO of the city of Philadelphia. And I'm so excited for Mark to share his city perspectives with the group today. So I'm going to hand it over to Greg. Greg, I want to invite you to start us off. You've done some incredible research, and I'm excited for you to share it with all of us today and anchor this conversation. So over to you.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And special thanks, of course, to Anthony and Michael and at the Cornell Tech side, as well as to Mark and Mindy for joining us to talk about, yes, not a speculative future about augmented reality AI, but uses today and how it applies directly to how cities can harness it and manage it and use it to further their own infrastructure goals. And so I want to share a few slides. I think it'll help. Visuals always help with this particular kind of thing here. So let's talk about, I'd love to start with, for example, the Apple Vision Pro, released almost a year ago to the day that we're having this conversation. An example of perhaps of augmented reality. You might call it spatial computing, as Apple did. And this is an example of hardware for its own sake. I think we would all agree that the Apple Vision Pro has a bit fizzled. It has not been the next great replacement for the iPhone like Apple perhaps hoped it would. But I bring it to your attention in part, or as the inspiration of my report for Cornell Tech, is that within hours of its release last year, of course, here you are seen as placid, sitting on a couch, perfectly indoors. But within hours of its release last year, we saw videos like this being posted to TikTok of hardware escaping into the real world. This, of course, is completely faked. The Apple Vision Pro, you can't use it while you're moving. But, this idea of people, you wearing these devices out in the real world, obscuring reality itself in the middle of urban infrastructure uh, for danger and for clout. And I bring this up because another faked example here of supposedly someone using the device while using also Tesla Autopilot in their Cybertruck within hours, again, earned the attention of then Secretary Pete Buttigieg, admonishing them to keep both hands on the wheel in the metaverse. So I bring this up as an example of, yes, these technologies are being introduced to the world, are being introduced often without potential safeguards, and we need to be aware of potential misuse and also how we might harness them. And, the Apple Vision Pro may have fizzled, but we see Mark Zuckerberg here introducing his prototype project Orion augmented reality glasses. And again, augmented reality is the overlay of information on physical space versus escaping into the metaverse of virtual reality where you're erasing reality in a virtual world. And my report has all these definitions. But it's worth noting here that Mark Zuckerberg has spent, I believe to date, more than the Manhattan Project on these glasses, I think $75 billion in losses, but also has had some success with just taking their Meta Ray-Ban smart glasses and adding AI to it. So in this case, as you can see from this advertisement, you can literally ask an onboard artificial intelligence, the meta model, what is the done looking at? And so you can actually use it to interact with and see physical forms of physical forms of infrastructure. Sorry, I didn't turn the volume down on that one. That was Project Aria. That was before you, for a half second you saw there. Meta's research project, basically to use similar devices to create spatial maps of the world. And this is what Google plans to do with Android XR. This is their ad announced a month ago, where you, as aware of their forthcoming glasses with Samsung, will also have conversations with AI. Perhaps in this case, she's asking about the group chat. But as you'll see this play out, she will ask to be led to a location. It will show wayfinding. And you can see here how these forms of computing will start to interact with forms of physical infrastructure in this case. We can skip here. I think she'll go around the corner in just a moment if you want to see example how they're showing this. Yes, what's the way to serendipity cards? Here, lead the way and turn right towards 10th Avenue, overlaying maps onto the physical world. This will become more and more both common, I think, and potentially powerful. Here you're looking at the launch video of a university project by NYU, Courant, and Hong Kong University called Virtual in Real Life. Signing Ji, who joined us at the Cornell Tech Urban Tech Summit in November, talked about this, in which case they gave AI agents, basically large language models that have the ability to think and, well, think is a bit much, but to remember, reflect, and act. In this case, those agents were set loose inside of Google Street View. They were able, for example, to count, as you can see here, count all of the park benches and count all of the trash bins inside of Central Park and report back what they see. So this points to, and follow me now, is the idea that we might have new ways of actually monitoring, interacting with, counting, and continuing to basically, yeah, literally interact with forms of infrastructure. Sorry if I'm redundant here, but you can see it again for wayfinding, other forms of routing. And you might actually have literal conversations with it. One of the things that came out of the report, this is a prototype of what they called the spirit of the San Francisco Ferry Building. It's an AI agent created by Niantic, maker of Pokemon Go, and several partners. And here you can actually imagine having a conversation with the ferry building about where to go, what's available, and these sorts of things. So we're on the cusp of actually imagining not just, not just building infrastructure, but imagining how we might actually have conversations with it to unpack its potential uses. And going back to the Apple Vision Pro for a moment, again, thinking through how all of these technologies come back to infrastructure, this is an application created for the Apple Vision Pro to help with maintenance, in this case of Rolls-Royce jet engines. This is by the airline Air France KLM. So here you can imagine an empowered workforce that is literally able to basically work through incredibly complex tasks of maintaining forms of infrastructure by bringing it up and visualizing it. Another app in their app store imagines how you might do inspections of buildings. In this case, look, here's an HVAC system. Look up as it walks you through. It's able to actually see and recognize and monitor the status and overlay data of these various systems. So we can imagine how our ongoing workforce might be transformed by the ability to harness these tools. And this is another one. Argyle XR is the name of this startup. In this case, it's output from building information management systems. So you can literally see the forms of built and unbuilt buildings, like X-rays into the actual built environment of the underlying data there. So incredible tools for visualization and understanding what's happening there. And then there's another piece as well, which I think Mindy will speak to, which is also, how we can use such tools for public art and for engagement. Next month in New York City, you're seeing here a visualization here of the Bloomberg Philanthropies efforts to honor the Gates, which is Christo's famous installation from 2005 in Central Park. There will be an augmented reality app visible through your phone to actually visualize what parts of the Gates look like. So in this case, it's a civic engagement tool, it's an educational tool, and yeah, a form of remembering and bringing back to life a piece of temporary art. And then, of course, we'll also hear from Mindy about sort of the work of In Situ, which is a New York-based startup that is, again, using phone-based augmented reality, very simple tools, to show residents of neighborhoods and other stakeholders forthcoming projects to literally show buildings in situ, as the name implies. And so in this case, you can see that the idea of is that you can win over skeptical residents, perhaps of proposed projects, by showing them, by seeing is believing where it will fit in. And Mindy will talk a bit about how they use this tool to great effect in Columbus with their recent transit referendum with CODA. And so finally, just quickly, this is my report, The Augmented City, that we published in December. I just want to quickly walk through the findings. We gathered together Mark Wheeler, a team of other cohort of former and current public officials to guide them through, basically raise questions and issues and how cities should think about this. And we used a foresight methodology called threat casting, where we basically told stories about the future and surfaced various themes. And in this case, we found 3 threats and 3 opportunities about how augmented reality and AI might play out in cities. The first one is that basically all the problems we have now with social media and AI and all these other tools will simply get worse as they extend themselves into the physical realm and will become the problem of cities, not just, of course, of federal or state regulators as an information medium, but as a physical medium. So thinking about how it might actually start overlaying or blanking out the real world. We'll see it'll become an issue for law enforcement and for others as, various forms of scams, pig butchering and others are brought to bear in new media as well. So how do we protect people in these particular places? Third, one of the big themes that came out is that, neighborhoods that are targets of gentrification or otherwise marginalized might be denied services as they make their way into augmented reality, or they might be targets to be used for new forms of gentrification. And then when it comes to opportunities, we surface 3. One is that, AR and AI might become the new interface for civic technology. It might be a way for cities to deliver services and to increase its engagement. And that's what we'll hear about a bit today. Another one is that, this raises, again, new questions about what kind of civic roles should emerge to deal with this. How should cities think holistically about not just AI and AR, but all forms of new technologies that are arriving? How do you monitor and screen for them and incorporate them into projects in exactly the ways that the series is about, in terms of not just here's this new technology, how do I use it, but what are the intractable problems we have and how might this actually help? And then the final one, which is a bit beyond scope for today, but it's also a question of not just how cities will use it, but how citizens will take it into their own hands as well. And how might we see communities use this to tell stories about themselves and to bring themselves forth? So I'll stop sharing there, but can't wait to unpack. And it's my pleasure with Mark and with Mindy here that we'll hear some actual real thoughts from civic leaders who grapple with this and also really used it to their end. So back to you, Tina.
Thank you. Oh gosh, Greg, there's so many directions we could take this. I'm really appreciating and want to remind everybody or point folks to the chat where Anthony Townsend just dropped a link to Greg's report so you can take time for yourself to read it in more detail. But Greg, one initial question I have for you is sort of as you were doing your research, I mean, you just shared with us a whole bunch of really interesting use cases and examples of where this technology is being used. I'd love to hear from you. What surprised you most in doing this research? Maybe the one thing you weren't looking for, but made you see everything else in a different light.
Well, the one that really stood out is when I started this project, there was a time a few years ago we were all talking about the metaverse, of course, and Mark Zuckerberg and blockchains where this would go. But
Yeah,
it's been in the last year or so that really how AI has moved to the forefront. And what we all thought was going to be the Apple Vision Pro and visuals overseeing it, it's really about these tools are going to be carriers for AI. This is how AI gets out into the physical world. And a lot of these tools are going to be building maps by AI for other AIs. And I think that's going to be something that could be really powerful for cities and really dangerous as well. So, for example, that demo I
mm,
showed you of virtual in real life, like, this idea of building constantly refreshed digital twins, and I'm sure we've chatted about this before, digital twins of the world. Well, this is going to really increase the use of that because now you'll have AIs that can go into those digital twins to count things, to act inside them, to offer guidance. Suddenly the whole trajectory, I think, of this technology has changed in just the last year. And, if we all thought chatbots was going to be the future of AI forever, this
yeah,
is where I think it's headed, is, this ability to actually converse with a building, with a bridge, with anything. And cities are going to have to think about this. It changes engagement and customer service and all sorts of things when now you
yeah.
can talk up to AI in the world.
This is fascinating. And to that point you make, um, the examples you just showed seem way more accessible, right? And sort of like meet folks literally and figuratively where they're at, rather than like chat box that can sometimes be a bit I don't know, janky is not a technical term, but like they're not as smooth of an experience, right? Not as so I'm taking that away as really interesting. I have more questions for you, but I want to come to Mindy. And Mindy, want to ask you a few questions just to anchor us and anchor the group in the work that you've done. Greg just shared an example that in situ, the AR solution that you've helped to bring to life. So if we can get Mindy on the screen. Mindy, I want you to share a brief sort of bit about your background. How'd you get into this work?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I was having tech issues. So of course I am not on video, but I am on sound,
Okay.
hopefully sounding good. Hopefully you can hear me well.
We
Okay,
can hear
thank
you.
you. Yeah, so I've been in communication and engagement for nearly 20 years now, and I have spent the lion's share of my time in infrastructure, transportation, and other community improvement types. So spent some time in travel and tourism telling that story, spent some time at the airport authority, and then some time in more what I would call transportation infrastructure type of scenarios. And so it's interesting because over the years, as this technology started to become something that people were pitched, if that makes sense, we had started to look into the reality of this. Should we do this? And I have to admit, it was clunky. I think you said it perfectly. At first, it got a little clunky, and it was feeling of how do we have to buy a set of glasses? What does this mean? And so it really wasn't until kind of this perfect apex of the city regional need and the right firm with a good tool that we felt was really good coming at the right time when we actually had budget. So it wasn't just political bandwidth, there was some available budget to draw from, which we all know like almost never happens. And those kind of all those factors came together to launch a product. So what I'll say is that Link Us is what we call our initiative regionally here. And it's really the Central Ohio Transit Authority's partnership with the city of Columbus around land use planning and transportation to grow our transit network. And transit is the backbone, but it's not the only part. Oops, I'm sorry. Do we have background noise? Pardon. Okay. So, transit is the backbone of the Link Us programming, but it's not the only thing. And so we found this need to communicate a lot about a massive program and gain some understanding. As we always said, there's kind of multiple things going on at one time. One part of that was building an implementable project. We quickly decided a year and a half ago. So, actually, yeah, about a year and a half ago, we need to move beyond a rendering. We need something in field. And we began brainstorming, perhaps building, right, a mock-up of what bus rapid transit would look like and how BRT has looks and feels that are very light rail, and it's a bus, and it's still different than what we see on the ground today, because in Columbus, Ohio, we have no BRT. We have
Mm,
no extensive commuter light rail either.
right.
Largest
Yeah.
city in the United States without that rapid transit system. So really it was, how do we do something that is compelling and engaging? I'm going to say something that's probably surprising to no one, that in the information age, it is harder than ever to get people's attention and get a message to stick. And
So Mindy, can you
so
tell
this
us,
helps.
can you tell us what did you use it for? Like,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, so we ended up using augmented reality as a portion of our community engagement program. And that was to communicate 3 different rapid transit lines, showing what one specifically rapid transit line would look like. So worked with Institute to do a hosted on demand, I'm sorry, a hosted on bus experience, 60 minutes pre-programmed and planned, where, to your point about the technology being part of the story, not the entire story, the technology was used to tell our story. So
Mm,
folks got on to a bus, they were invited, they scheduled, they got onto a bus, they sat down, they were given an entire tour that lasted 60 minutes. 3 stops, they got off at 3 different stops and held up their phone and looked at what was expected at that specific intersection. Not generally, like
yeah.
literally, where is that going to be geolocated at this stop? And then we told the story around it. So we use it as an engagement technique for the general public, for what I would call grass tops, for what I would call electeds, for all types of, but we use that in our toolbox to meet a variety of needs.
Well, and this sounds like, and I think we saw examples of this in Greg's presentation, it really helps to bring to life, right, like what that project could result in. And so I'm really appreciating the experience of folks getting off at those bus stops and then understanding what might be there, right? Just going back to Greg's presentation, I'd love to hear what were some of the challenges that y'all went through on the first try with this project? And, well, yeah, actually, answer that question first.
Yeah, so the biggest challenge that we faced was just deploying something for the first time, right? We were
Yeah.
really fortunate that what we didn't have as a challenge in this case was political capital, political
Mm,
will. The really good news is we were at a time where we had some Columbus City Council members,
yeah.
some Columbus administration professionals, and leaders within the transit agency who are all very on board, love the bus puns, with this as a tool and wanting to do something bigger and bolder than we've done. So that was lovely. And we've worked extensively with all of those clients. So we had a nice convergence of shared trust, but then working on it for the first time, we know what it is to stand up a project, but when you never done it, you just got to learn. So we spent a lot of time, and this is where, in this case, Institute did a phenomenal job of just coming on site and being there for us and teaching us how to use the tech ourselves and how to do some administrative elements of it. The other part was, I think, just explaining to folks, trust us.
Mm,
Come
hmm.
here, come on the tour. If you're
Yeah.
not sure what AR is or is not, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
You want to know what's coming, we'll take care of the rest. And there was a bigger, it's interesting, we did this over several months. We did it over, gosh, about 6 months total in different capacities, kind of went off and on in different months. And sure enough, still 4 months in, the same kind of questions kept surfacing of like, oh, well, I'm not sure. Will I be able to download the app, or will I be able to? The same sort of like angst had happened.
Yeah.
And the good news is everybody felt good by the time they were done with it. But boy, I think that's really important to note. Like, this hasn't become commonplace just yet. Kind of scanning a QR code is so common now.
Yeah.
This, it hasn't just yet. So that challenge persisted. It will be there for a minute until something like this is a little more commonplace. And as long as you're
Mhm.
patient with folks, they ended up always completely getting it. By the time they were done with the first stop, second stop, they could do it all by themselves.
I love it. Uptake wasn't a challenge. Let me ask you, Mindy, before we go to Mark, what benefits surprised you in this project in Columbus?
Yeah, what surprised me is the degree of detailed questions that it evoked.
Mm,
I've done infrastructure engagement for quite a while, and it can be very hard for us as professionals, whether you're urban planning professional, engagement professional, to ask questions that will pull out of folks what it is, not just that they need to know, but will help
mhm.
you to design and implement a better project that is more conducive to the space itself. And
Yeah.
the visual on site, when the phone is up and they're looking at the intersection, they go, oh, I see. So will there be red paint on the street? I've last time we did this, there was an issue with the red paint. A lot of the questions that community members asked were just so much more informed and deep in the nuances that we were able to understand how to better design the project. I use paint because I know we all know what those answers are. That's an easier one from a technical side of the house, but they really surfaced, well, what about the view, the viewpoint, and just the neighborhood questions were way more nuanced, way more
Mm,
helpful, and we were able to adapt a couple design elements based on those pieces of feedback.
that's fantastic. Mindy, thank you for grounding us and sharing a real example because, again, so much of this is like, oh, this is this futuristic technology. And I think what Mindy's just told the story of is a really practical example in Columbus, Ohio, of how this technology was leveraged, which is so exciting. All right, Mark, I want to come to you. And as I mentioned in the introductions, everyone, Mark Wheeler, um, in a prior role, was the Chief Information Officer for the City of Philadelphia. Mark, welcome. And to start us off, I just want to invite you. Um, Given folks on the call today are here representing their communities and their cities, I'd love to just hear some of your reflections on what Greg and Mindy have shared about the use of AI and augmented reality technology.
Thanks, Tina. I'd be happy to. Well, first of all, I want to encourage everyone to read the report that Greg put together. It's one of the better formulated planning reports on I think, an issue that we can all, just on first blush, feel that it's very, very close to happening. This isn't something that we're
Mm,
predicting way out in the future. We've seen these technologies evolve very, very quickly, and it feels like we're on the cusp of having this kind of rush at our cities. And the report does a really good job of thinking about how to prepare for that rush and getting us more prepared. The and what Mindy said, I resonates with the work that I did, because prior to being a CIO, I was a city planner. And I think somewhere in the early teens, when I had transitioned into the technology role, we began to see from vendors these introduction of QR code tools for both planning, development, engagement, historic preservation type of work. I remember vendors showing us, I think from Cisco, very, very clunky goggles that a public works employee could put on while they were in the field with some kind of computer gear around them and get the 3D overlay of infrastructure at the site they were looking on. And of course, all of that depends on having well-structured, GIS data in your community that then you can use in these augmented reality perspectives. I
mm,
do think that we're there for this to happen. And that's why I think communities need to pay attention to what's in this report and the tools that you can use to spot the early flags and the problems that may occur, and then what approaches you would need to take to deal with that. Even in 2020, when I was in Barcelona, the metro system had created a program using QR codes that would help people with different types of disabilities, whether it was seeing, hearing, or cognitive problems. The QR codes would reflect information back to you to help you navigate the system. And I could see that happening in many US cities now, just from what we saw with Greg's demonstration with some of
yeah.
these lightweight, easy to use glasses. It's not going to be as clunky as holding up your phone, and that's where we're going.
Yeah.
You know, I think city planning and zoning departments are going to struggle with some of the examples of the problems that Greg points out, such as the veiling, where, you know, one business tries to make another business, their competitor, you know, invisible when you're wearing the glasses. It might be the same thing for communities where you're trying to promote tourism, you're trying to promote, again, commercial businesses, and you navigate people, you know, in ways that avoid certain communities so they don't get the foot traffic. And what are we going to do as communities when commercial businesses are employing these tools and they become very, very easy to use? And it's not a matter of having to hold up your phone and walk around, but it's in glasses. And Greg and I have had some really robust conversations about what I think is possible for some communities to be able to create something that would be akin to a virtual zoning or virtual advertising regulations. Now, those are going to fly against our laws on free speech, and whether that's free speech or it is actually a form of commercialization and use of the right of way. This becomes a use of the right of way that we have to pay to use. But to me, it's a use of that public space. And if we're pushing people around and we're pushing people to certain locations with those commercial tools, I think that there's a strong case to be made that we could potentially regulate that at some point. I'm not big on the regulation, but you know, to avoid some of the dystopian examples that we see in the report, we're going to have to take a more engaged hand on this, and start with the examples I think that are really beneficial to the communities, like Mindy did in Columbus, Ohio, with in C2.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was a fantastic example of like where someone could start now. I want to hear from you a bit more on like, why do you think now is the time to start engaging with this technology? One thing I appreciate, I'm sort of chuckling about Greg's presentation was, you know, this, there's been a bit of a journey on the big tech side of like, okay, it's all about the metaverse, right? We saw a lot of investment there, and then it's pulling back a little bit. Like, and one thing I oftentimes think about on the Govy side is let the private sector go through that evolution. And once it gets, you know, once the technology is in a good place, then that makes more sense. But how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you bring up the metaverse side, because when Greg first asked me to join the cohort, that's exactly what I thought that was metaverse. Well, we've all proven how silly that is. I mean, that rollout was just an absolutely ridiculous use of this type
Yeah.
of technology, right? Sit at your desk with goggles and interact with cartoons.
Yeah.
The the thing I think about is the phone, how it
Hmm.
had gone from a communication tool to a complete information sharing tool. It became our lifeline to the rest of the world, with the internet and the digital divide. It's how we do all of our interactions with the world in many cases, and it's now our identity. We pay with the phone. We have our bank accounts linked to the phone. We get into concert venues, into buildings with codes on our phone.
Yeah.
The idea that we're not going to hold this up and feel comfortable holding it up and see a new version of reality, I think
Yeah.
is a little bit of a tired perspective. And I remember hearing this from planners just a few years ago about using QR codes on sites to do some type of visualization. That you know, people won't download the app, like Mindy said. They won't want to hold up the phones. I call that the digital dexterity divide, that I
Like
think
it.
is a real thing, but the
Yeah.
digital divide isn't anymore. And Philadelphia proved that in a study in 2021, where we looked at adoption rates of broadband and confirmed what those of us who had been working in the digital divide space were thinking, is that it's not that people aren't connected. They're not connected in the ways that we traditionally think they should be, which is the wire line to the house with the ubiquitous always on
Mhm.
connections. You know, they are getting by with low cost plans, which means they have
Mhm.
connectivity issues, but they are highly digitally dexterous. They know how to manipulate and get around these apps. And I think the adoption rate for some of these tools, especially if it connects communities, helps people wayfind to places that are really exciting and novel, creates public art, creates a way to re-envision a space that is abandoned and depressing in your neighborhood, and you can galvanize support around changing it into something new. I think people
Yeah.
are going to buy into that very, very quickly. And
Totally.
that's where it tips into the negative situations of somebody
Mm.
trying to dunk on someone using, hate speech and disparaging visuals and language, and all of that. And that becomes available depending on what type of system you're using and buying into.
Yeah. That deeply resonates, and I'd love if we can get all the panelists sort of on the screen, because I have a couple questions that I'd love to get everyone's take on. Well, and actually first, Anthony, you have a question top of mind. Let me invite you to come off mute.
Yeah, so thinking about like what the world looks like, what the city looks like through these glasses, right? There's one version of it that Greg showed, which is it's basically like a Google map superimposed on the world. We all know that, you have to kind of pay to get featured on Google Maps. So like merchants that pay, they're visible. Merchants that don't pay, you can't see them. And like thinking about that and the application you showed of talking to the San Francisco Ferry Building, right? Like when you look at a Google map, all that stuff that's invisible, sort of like at the bottom of that map, that's the stuff that we paid for, right? The taxpayers. And that's the stuff that like right now we're seeing like really big challenges to the idea that like that's a valuable thing to invest in. So I'm wondering, like even before we get to the use case that Mindy described of like trying to get the public excited about the new project, are there opportunities for cities, maybe leveraging existing digital assets they have like GIS to start to explore like how do we make the value and the benefits that our public infrastructure provides visible in this new realm in a way that maybe people can't see like in other digital realms? Here's what the panelists' thoughts are on that.
I guess I'll go quickly first. I think because there was a question earlier in the chat here too about Laura had a great question about visualizing flooding and weather events, and obviously I know there's some great AI flood tools in New York to like visualize where flooding would happen, but yeah, there's already been some great examples of using XR technologies to basically show like where flooding on Roosevelt Island itself would happen. I believe that's Wendy Ju's team there at Cornell Tech has done that. Yeah, I could totally imagine how we could basically use that to as again, it implies a bit more maturity in the technology. But yeah, the ability to show people like vulnerabilities in their neighborhoods or show how infrastructure might improve that or mitigate some of those vulnerabilities, I think would be a great form of public outreach programs here in the sense of like, this is where you're vulnerable. This is where we can help you kind of thing. So that immediately stands out to me. And yeah, and I think also to the point about public art and with the Gates, I just want to point that like, that seems to be the tip of the spear in so many of the use cases that I talked about. I also just had a conversation with a staffer at the National Endowment for the Arts this week, where they're getting a lot of inbound grant applications incorporating AR into their placemaking initiative. So we're seeing like how this is holistically being involved in this to basically help people show like the value of placemaking and how we can beautify parts of the public realm. So I don't know, those are two examples that stand out to me. But yeah, I'd love to hear Mark and Mindy's thoughts.
May I add a point to that? I just came off a call from the National League of Cities to educate small cities on infrastructure hubs and infrastructure money. And during the call, of course, there's a hold and pause on all funding. And they said the criteria that they'd been given for new funding would be number one, energy independence. Number two, consumer choice, and then number three, DEI removed. But going back to energy independence, that leads to the notion that if you are weather prepared, emergency prepared, stormwater prepared, wind prepared, for example, a little town in North Georgia that was in the path of, it's a college town called Young Harris, in the path of Hurricane Helene. How are you able to use walking, biking, safe street infrastructure to stack onto some sort of emergency prep hub that would have energy independence during whatever disruption? That's what I'm looking for in the mix. And that you use these tools for that sense of preparedness for a neighborhood or a district. And day-to-day life, it's placemaking and delightful and has art, but also doubles as the emergency transfer point that DHS communicate.
And Laura, if I could step in right there to answer that a little bit on the consumer choice side, I think one of the things that we saw was especially with our electeds in our different jurisdictions in this region, there's different senses of awareness on what is a Republican thing, what is a Democratic thing. And we can move beyond that. We don't need to. Municipal governance doesn't need that. And one of these things I think gives electeds a sense of what is that consumer choice of public infrastructure. We had very positive conversations, regardless of what side of the aisle or kind of what wing of the side of the aisle you were on. Not that everybody and their brother was just so excited about it, but more that everybody was asking the right questions about it. They were like, oh, I see this, but what about that? And what about stormwater retention? And wow, I love that height. Wow, what about adding this to the side of it? Could we do that as a municipal add-on in our jurisdiction? And those are the conversations, I think, moving it away from the idea of what does it mean to be DEI or blah, 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 separate from all of that, is that this is like, no, the consumer wants it. In this case, the consumer taxpayer wants it. It can help get a better sense of do they or don't they?
Anthony, I was thinking about your question and all of the data that we have available to ourselves in city government that we don't end up always visualizing and mapping on the commercial grants, public infrastructure and investment side. If you think about commercial corridors, you can do before and after visuals now. You can basically do a tour of the community and look at the buildings and get all kinds of data enrichment based on the investments we've made from capital improvement plans or different grant programs, you know, and who that is impacted. And there could be some great storytelling and maybe even more investment, galvanizing more investment in those communities using those tools. But also thinking about what Greg had said about how AI is supercharging this. If we just project out that we give communities, in some cases, apps that the community has developed, our 311 tools. What if those 311 tools take advantage of LiDAR and AR and kind of evaluate that landscape while you're pointing up the camera and collects all kinds of information about the code enforcement that now helps the code enforcers understand exactly what the intervention needs to be very easily, marries it up to the code. The code becomes almost an intelligent review of what's happening in real time. I think of the grant programs or the loan programs to homeowners to improve and make repairs to like windows and doors and, you know, improve the heating and energy efficiency. Think about an app that's using that LiDAR and AI compared to your both code and your requirements for the grant, and is immediately telling people what qualifies for that loan right now, and then maybe generates the report in the application for them in real time that it's going to be used for these window ceilings, it's going to be used for this heating system. And, you know, we accelerate some of the delivery and use and targeting of those tools with AI data and AR, LiDAR, and, you know, a combination fusion of those different technologies.
Thanks, Mark. I'm just noting like I have this like growing list of like 20 more questions that I want to ask about this. So Anthony, we might need to do a part 2 because there's so much here. What I do want to do is if I can have Ryan or Manny or Jay put up the final poll questions. We're going to keep asking questions of our speakers. But just for folks, before you have to drop from this session, we just want to ask if this session expanded your existing knowledge on using augmented reality for community engagement. And then also, you know, we want to get your thoughts for a follow-up webinar. So take a moment to answer those. For our panelists, though, picking from my list of 20 questions, I want to ask, like, what's a piece of advice you have for cities on how they might get started? Like y'all have made clear there is no reason to be intimidated about leveraging this technology in communities today, right? We've heard a lot of like really practical use cases. What's your advice for how cities should get started? And that might be an action they can take or a partnership they should maybe start exploring, or even like who in their city should be like the lead on something like this, right? Like Mark, is it your former planner self or your former CIO self? So that's the question for you. What's a piece of advice for the cities on the call today to get started? And for our panelists, I'll invite any of you to get us started.
I'll jump in again quickly. So two things. One, like I said, public art seems to be the tip of the spear, and a lot of history, a lot of education aspect comes up with this. In talking to Jason Crockett, who was previously with the city of LA and was most recently at Snap overseeing some of their outreach, they worked a lot with city governments and arts institutions that were visualizing historic Black neighborhoods and working with museums and basically trying to take artwork and education out into the physical world again to meet people where they were. So they, in that case, a lot of the patterns would be an elected who was very into this but didn't have capacity internally at the city, and so they would, Snap would help them find an artist or a developer who could do some work of this, and that was a way to sort of make those initial baby steps. Going forward, I'm personally heartened by roles like, Chief Public Realm Officer in New York. I think we've seen recently the sort of move towards more holistic integration of city departments, or the recognition that it cuts across things, and the digital will hopefully slot into that one. And so I think roles like that should incorporate more of a digital element. But as Mark will tell you, when I worked on the report and listened to people like Mark and others have these debates about it, there was debates about, do you have a chief metaverse officer? Thankfully, I think we've all realized that was a really poor idea at the time. But it seems like every department is going to have some need for this. One final note of this: I had Jackie Liu, who now runs Helpful Places. She was the chief data officer for New York City Parks when Pokemon Go happened a decade ago, and it was basically Jackie to help parks figure out what was going on when crowds were stampeding through Central Park. So there will need to be some sort of role to really build that capacity, a single person at least inside of that who can be that scout for these kinds of technologies and when they're happening. So lots of ways to approach that.
I love that. And I just want to triple underline that point around they're both unique roles that could sort of lead on this work. And there's something about every role in government building a comfort and familiarity with some of these technologies, right? So embedding that throughout city departments feels really important as well. Mindy,
Yeah,
how about you?
yeah, I would say the biggest thing that you could do quickly is find out what's the biggest problem that needs solved. For us, we needed to communicate something really expansive. And the reason the political capital was there was we had a big undertaking in front of us. So I don't know whether it's has to do with flooding and stormwater retention, if it has to do with your master planning and nobody's wanting to pay attention to begin to plan for the future in a bigger way, regardless of what that is, find that thing that has a real need that some elected or it doesn't have to be an elected, like a director of a department has a real need to get people's attention on. And if you can shoehorn in a small version, right, of something like this that has any realm of success, you can go see, look, it's not as scary anymore. And then folks can start having that more thoughtful conversation of, oh, what are some other great applications? So I just encourage, go with low-hanging fruit rather than the prettiest, because I agree with you, Greg, on art and all, but I gotta say, if resiliency and stormwater is your issue, go find that first, man. That's going to get an elected to pay attention and give you the political capital you need to bite it off.
Mindy, I love that pragmatism. Mark, bring us home.
Yeah,
What you got?
I'd say that because we got a range of city, towns, county people on the call, that I would go and find your GIS staff. That no matter what size you are, you typically have a GIS analyst, manager. These are the people who professionally, day in, day out, visualize data for you, analyze, visualize data, and they're typically the most industrious and innovative staff members that you have. I bet they're aware of these tools. I bet they have contacts with local industry and local academia who are evaluating and trying to explore AR, VR tools. I would start there because the data that many of you want to look at, according to the questions, is data that GIS team is already, bringing in, centralizing, and evaluating it in 2D and 3D.
Thank you, Mark. And one thing I want to highlight across those answers, there was no single answer. And I think that in and of itself demonstrates the opportunity and the possibilities here with leveraging this technology. There's not a single profile in your city or county government that is going to unlock this, but rather it's starting with the problem you're trying to solve and then going from there. I want to say thank you, big thanks to our speakers and to all of you for a really engaging session. Greg, you made AR way more approachable and accessible just for me personally. So I can't wait to dig into the report more myself. Encourage all of our attendees today to do the same. I invite you to save the date for our next session, which is going to be Wednesday, February 26th. And if we can go to the next slide, want to reiterate a plug that Greg made in his presentation. New York City is about to host a free augmented reality experience in Central Park to celebrate the 20th anniversary of The Gates by Christo and Jean-Claude. That was up in 2005. So if you're in New York between February 12th to March 23rd, you can use the free Bloomberg Connects app to experience that art, to experience, to just combine these elements. And it's a great example of how cities can do what Mindy and Greg and Mark were talking about, activating parks and public spaces in innovative ways with little impact to the environment, bringing folks together, including visitors and tourists, and just engaging new audiences in city history. Thanks so much for joining. I want to remind you that the Local Infrastructure Hub website is a great way to see upcoming events. There's some great upcoming programming and case studies on resilient infrastructure and equitable transportation that you can check out. And otherwise, take good care of yourselves, everyone. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next month. Bye.